Gumba Malgon Gumba Nani Gia Nindu, which is good evening, it's good to see you, and that's in Barragum, which is the traditional language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. And 2019 is the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and here at the State Library we'll use the opportunity to profile the significant amount of work that we've done over the last decade to document, collect and preserve and make accessible traditional languages of Queensland. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and my name is Vicky McDonald, and it's certainly my great privilege to be your State Librarian and CEO here at the State Library of Queensland, and also to welcome you to this evening's Game Changers with Julieanne Alroe. I'd also like to extend a really warm welcome to the people who are watching us this evening via live stream on Twitter. But let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to the ancestors who came before them. The State Library of Queensland is located on Kurilpa Point, which is a traditional meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition here at State Library today and every day of the year. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome our speaker for tonight, business leader Julieanne Alroe, current Chair of Infrastructure Australia, our facilitator for this evening's conversation, Ray Weeks, Chairman of the CEO Institute, members of the Queensland Library Foundation Council, the QUT Business School and the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Governing Committee. Also, a really warm welcome to our generous donors and partners, Pitcher Partners, Channel 7, Morgans, NAB and RACQ, and of course to all our friends and supporters of the State Library of Queensland. This evening's event series brings together innovative leaders from business, technology and creative industries together to share their insights with us. It's an opportunity to hear candid personal reflections of some of Queensland's game changers who have helped to shape the way that we do business. Their stories inspire us to think bigger and better and to create new possibilities. The Game Changers series is an initiative of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame and was established in 2009 by the QUT Business School, the State Library of Queensland and the Queensland Library Foundation. The Hall of Fame celebrates, records and retells stories of Queensland's outstanding business leaders and their many contributions to the development of our state. Over the past decade, State Library has acknowledged the considerable contribution of the business community has made to Queensland. The Hall of Fame now has 70 inductees, which is truly a testament to the extraordinary depth of Queensland talent. Each year, the State Library, together with the QUT Business School and through the Hall of Fame, acknowledges a fellowship which enables research into Queensland's business and economic history. The 2018 fellow is Hilary Davis, and her topic is Putting Queenslanders on the Road, the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency Limited story. Hilary aims to improve our knowledge about Queensland's motor industry in the early 20th century using State Library's extensive collections. She will research the achievements of the Canada Cycle and also the Motor Agency. You can explore past inductees, the work of Hilary and other past research fellows, as well as previous Game Changer speakers on the Hall of Fame website, so it's there for you to have a look at when you choose. Before we get to tonight's guest, I'd like to encourage you to also see our exhibition, which will be at South Bank in the SLQ Gallery, and you may have seen the slides before we started. The exhibition is titled Home, A Suburban Obsession, and it's an exhibition that we're particularly excited about. It's based on the Frank and Eunice Corley collection that we hold here at the State Library. In the 1960s and 70s, Frank and Eunice traipsed around southeast Queensland in their pink Cadillac, and Frank was taking photographs of Queensland homes, and their business model was to take the photographs and then put them onto calendars and postcards and sell them to the homeowners. Eunice was on a caravan on the back of the pink Cadillac doing the developing and that sort of thing. So we have over 61,000 photographs that we want to share with you in this exhibition, and it opens next Friday. So it is Australia's largest single photographic collection of housing in existence. So we also have developed an interesting interactive map through a product called the Corley Explorer, which will allow you to search for images of your house and perhaps document what it now looks like. So it is quite exciting, and we know that a lot of people are really excited about the opportunity to explore that collection. But tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Julieanne Alroe. With more than 30 years in the aviation industry, Julieanne is one of the few women in the world to run a privatised airport. Following the conversation with Ray, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A, so save up your questions and be ready to ask the questions. But if you are watching via live stream, you can ask your questions via the hashtag QBLHOF. If you're in the auditorium tonight, as I said, save up your questions and you'll have the opportunity to ask them. If you need to leave early, can I please ask you to leave through the rear door, and that way you won't disrupt the evening as well. And of course, if you've got a mobile phone, if you could switch it to silent as well, that would be fantastic. I know that many of you have been to our other events, so it's fantastic to see you here again, and I hope that you enjoy this evening's conversation. But please, I invite Ray Weeks to come to the stage to introduce Julieanne. So, Ray.
Good evening, and thanks, Vicky, very much. A game changer, as I think all of us know, is one who approaches business in a way that disrupts the status quo, challenges the norms, and creates a new way of thinking. So tonight you're going to hear from the former CEO and Managing Director of Brisbane Airport Corporation, Julieanne Alroe, a 40-year veteran of the aviation industry, on her story as a game changer and as an entrepreneur and as a major business leader, on the leadership that mattered to her in delivering such a successful career in the Sydney and Brisbane Airport Corporations. And this in two of some of the most heavily male-dominated environments, which we'll explore a little later. In June this year, Julieanne stepped down from her role with the Brisbane Airport Corporation, which she had held since 2009. She was one of very few women in the world to run a privatised airport, and under her leadership, the company grew to be recognised as one of the most successful, engaged and innovative companies in the country. And Brisbane's new runway, now under construction, and the largest aviation project in the country, is a testament to her tenacity and her capacity. Her distinct vision of BAC's role in the community also resulted in innovative partnerships across the arts, local business and the tourism industry. And her efforts in community engagement and philanthropic endeavours set a new standard for airports nationwide. And thanks to her legacy, Brisbane is now recognised, as Vicky mentioned, globally as the best in the Australia-Pacific region. Because she's been in the same industry for about 40 years, she said to me the other day that maybe she could be described as a museum piece. No way. You'll understand shortly why that's definitely not the case. You'll also understand tonight why, which I found really interesting, why fixing things, making things work, and the infrastructure space is so exciting for her. The good to great leaders are described as having humility and fierce resolve. I think Julieanne, and she mentioned this to me, is happy to be described as having humility, but with dogged determination. You'll understand that as well. She's a business leader who clearly feels comfortable living with uncertainty, and like all good leaders, has a real tolerance for ambiguity. So Julieanne is currently Chair of Infrastructure Australia, Director of ERM Power on the American Chamber of Commerce in Queensland, and is the Inaugural President of the Queensland Futures Institute. So please welcome Julieanne Alroe. Julieanne, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Ray. I think after all that, I'm going to be a disappointment, I hope.
I said before that a game changer is one who approaches business in a way that disrupts the status quo, challenges the norms, and also creates a new way of doing things. Do you see yourself as a game changer?
Well, I think in terms of, I suppose, the way I approach Brisbane Airport, yes. You know, it's probably, you need to know the industry quite well to understand why that would be the case, so maybe a little bit of explanation. But since privatisation back in '96, airports had sort of got themselves stuck in a bit of a sitting outside the city, sitting outside the system, because we were federally legislated, but living in cities and in our states, but very little engagement with them. And we'd almost become defensive. And in in some cases, highly politicised, and Sydney was certainly in that space. And for anybody who sort of remembers when the second runway or the parallel runway opened in Sydney, you know, that airport was blockaded. You know, it almost changed the government at the time. John Howard, you know, brought in a whole lot of changes, and that sort of really established that the coalition in Sydney. So the airport had sort of got itself into really, you know, deep trouble. And I was part of all trying to get us out of that. So when I came to Brisbane, you know, Brisbane had been designed differently, had been conceived differently, but it hadn't taken advantage of those things. And it just seemed to me extraordinary that a city and its airport should be at outs. What's the point of an airport if you're not getting on with your city? And a city nowadays is not going to go anywhere without a good airport. So it took some time, but I felt the important thing was that we had to be fully integrated to the city. We had to be part of the city, not something stuck out on the edge of the bay that didn't really matter. So that changed a long time because a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of politics involved in that. And but I think now, you know, the relationship with the state government, with the city, with the federal government are all really, really excellent. Relationship with the airlines, despite a natural tension there, is still very, very good. And I like to think, you know, going into what is going to be a big change for Brisbane when that new runway opens, it'll bring enormous prosperity, but it'll also come with some downside. And we've tried to create an environment, I think, of honesty and trust that we're going to do the very best job we can to bring that runway. They will bring it in. I've done my bit. Bring it in, I think, with the least harm to the community that is possible, and something that, you know, that causes grief.
But you understand how well connected the Brisbane Airport is when you get to Tullamarine, don't you? And try and get out, get into the city of Melbourne.
Yeah, and you know, there's some, you know, I think a genuine tragedy. When Tulla was first built, it was really in the boonies, and it should have been one of the best community-operated airports, pretty well in the world. But you know, unfortunately, both state and I think local governments allowed houses to creep out in and around the airport. So when Melbourne finally gets their runway approval, they are going to walk into a wave of problems.
Exactly.
Brisbane, unfortunately, I don't know whether it's good luck or good management, but for 30 years, they've maintained all of that zoning around the airport to build a really good buffer of industrial land around the airport, so you don't have houses like you do in Adelaide, Gold Coast and Sydney, 500 metres from the end of a runway.
That's
Yeah,
right.
extraordinary. That's been allowed to happen.
You stayed in the same industry for 40 years. What attracted you to stay in the industry? And also take us through some of the big learnings
Yeah.
that you had along the way.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I've ever been bored a day in my life. I think, yeah, so it's a very vibrant industry. It's got almost everything you want. You know, in a job, there's it's operational, so you're out there and you can see beginning and ends of things, which I like. You can make a difference quite quickly. It's people based. It's political, and I sort of love politics, so I thrive in that. It's constantly changing, and I like change. I actually, again, I thrive on change. When anything happens in a city, somehow the airport's caught up in it. So you're always current. You're always involved in things, and I just found that deeply fascinating all the time.
What did you better know about yourself as a result of this 40 years? What are your big learnings about yourself, and what you can deal with?
Well, I think I learnt as time went on, and I think you mentioned that I could deal with uncertainty. I could make decisions even though I didn't necessarily know everything that I needed to know to make that decision, because you couldn't always know. I was good at getting things done. I learnt I'm one of those relatively rare people, I think. I'm a finisher. And I think if you're ever hiring people, if you ever find a finisher, hire them, keep them, pay them lots, because finishers are the rarest things in the world. And I learned I could think strategically and I could implement. So, and I think, you know, we can all think about wonderful strategies, but can we actually get them to happen? And that's where I think you need to be determined and focused. So, bit by bit, I've learned all of those things about myself.
Good.
Yeah.
Now let's just go back to the early days for a minute. You grew up in Brisbane, went to school at St Rita's, and you did say that at St Rita's I found in myself the strength and capacity to succeed. Now describe why and how these early experiences shaped who you are today.
Yeah. I grew up in Brisbane. Mum and Dad were, I suppose, battlers. Neither had fathers. One hadn't come back very well from the war and committed suicide early. Another one just walked off in the Depression. So mum and dad, they had nothing. Anything they got, they pretty well did for themselves. I was the eldest of five. So if I was going to do anything beyond school, I had to pretty well do it for myself. So I think what I learned, particularly at St Rita's, I'd learnt that I liked to study, and I had a inquiring mind, and that I could focus and succeed. So, and I had a couple of truly wonderful teachers. I wish, probably in hindsight, they'd been maths teachers rather than English teachers, but I did, sort of look more into the arts side of things, and ideally loved history and English. And I was able to get a scholarship to go to university. And I do remember in career counselling at St Rita's, and bless their hearts, the options were nun, nurse and teacher, and pretty well in that order. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't really see myself as any of those three things. But I must admit, I did figure teaching was where I was going to end up, because that was probably more likely to get a teaching scholarship or, into teacher college, and that was probably where it was going to go. So when I got a full scholarship to university, still not knowing.
Made the difference.
Yeah, so I was able to do economics at UQ, and that sort of pretty well opened, any door that I wanted to push hard on. But I must admit, trying to get a job with an economics degree as a woman in Brisbane, or as a young woman in Brisbane in '76, wasn't going to happen. Public service was it, and I figured if I was going to be in the public service, I might as well go and do Canberra. So I went for the Commonwealth entry exam and got through that.
Yeah.
And just after I graduated, Mum and I packed up my Datsun 1600 or something like one, just a tin can, and drove
Small
to Canberra.
thing, yeah. Very small.
Yeah, just sort of went like that all the way to Canberra, and
Right.
And that was it. So I suppose. So like a lot of people in Brisbane in those days, I think, we were a battler city. The public service was what most of us did, unless you were lucky enough to get into one of the
Restricted opportunities.
Yeah.
Was there a moment where you had a crystal clear view on the direction of your future career? Any particular moment?
No, not really. I don't think life works like that.
No.
I think I've always I've had ambitions to be in certain industries. I wanted to be in aviation. I tried to get into Qantas and Ansett and TAA, and they said I was overqualified to be a flight attendant. And I didn't really want, and they didn't have any offices in Brisbane anyway. So to work in those industries, you had to be in Sydney and Melbourne. And they didn't have women in management. They just did not have women in management. So there was no way that was going to happen. So other than wanting to be in aviation, I think that's probably as close as I've come to Crystal. Other than that, I feel it's really been just being able to take opportunities when they arose, and just having a crack.
Position yourself for the right opportunity.
Yeah. And when I got to Canberra, I realised after about a year that aviation was owned by the government in those days. They owned Qantas, they owned TAA. So it took me a little while, but I got myself into the Department of, I think it was Transport Australia in those days. And then got myself into one of the aviation units, because in those days it was everything, rail, road, you name it. They ran out of Transport Australia. So I got myself into the aviation unit, and then I wangled myself a job in Sydney, which just happened to be at the airport. Because up until then I thought aviation really was airlines. But when I walked onto that airport, just everything about it I loved. And then, I just kept taking opportunity after opportunity. So it just kept on evolving.
So you're achieving senior management roles in a male-dominated environment. How did you deal with this lack of diversity? How did you handle that?
Look, I'd love to say I'd had some great struggle, but
No.
to be perfectly honest,
Mm.
I just went for it. Probably looking back, there might have been undercurrents, but I'm probably blissfully unaware of them at the time, and just kept on going. I think I always loved it, and I think everyone and aviation's a bit like that. We often joke that the Jet A1 gets into your blood, and I think people in the industry recognise like-minded people, and I always found I had a lot of support. I learned to play office politics pretty hard, but that.
Can you play the political game?
Yes, I can, but I'm not political, but I know how to play it. But you don't come through the bureaucracy for as many years as I did. I was in the bureaucracy for 15 years or so without understanding how that all works and working that through. Then the airports were created into Federal Airports Corporation, which is a government-owned corporation, then privatised individually. So I've seen lots of different iterations of how it all works. But there's always ambition, and people want jobs, and you want jobs. So you've got to know how to play hard. Yeah.
So under your stewardship, Brisbane Airport grew to become, as I was saying before, globally recognised the best airport
Yeah,
in the
it's
Australia
top 20
Pacific region.
in the world. Yeah,
Exactly. So what did you do differently to other airport leaders to differentiate your business in this way?
Well, I think if you don't do your core business well, forget it. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. People expect whatever you're doing to work effectively, and I'm sure we've all had various experiences at Brisbane Airport, not always perfect, but on the whole, I think Brisbane Airport runs very efficiently. We're privatised. We have obligations to shareholders, but we always took the attitude we have a broader stakeholder group than just the shareholders. But the shareholders will ultimately benefit longer term if you've got your customer base reasonably well serviced. One of the great perennial arguments in aviation or airports is who is the customer? Is it the airline? Is it the passenger? In my view, you can't really say it's either. It's both, and you've got to find a way to manage all of those things. And the airline aspirations, believe it or not, are often quite different to the passengers, economically perhaps. That we all want the customer to have a good experience, but how it's paid for and who does it and all that sort of stuff is quite an interesting dilemma going on. So I think more, trying to create a team that would be very much focused on working with people. I know of instances in airports where an airport manager has to ask customs permission to go into the customs hall because they're fighting with customs. That the airline won't pay their bills because they're fighting with the airlines. The community don't like them because there's problems. And what I wanted to do was sort of not to give in to people, but to understand that we all had something to contribute there. Then if we worked together, it was going to be better. And then if we were going to have the robust discussion, let's have the discussion. But at the end of the day, it's got to be something left on the table. It's unfortunately, like we're seeing nowadays, I don't believe in the zero-sum game. I've never seen that work longer term. And I think we're seeing it a little bit at the moment. With the finance industry, I think they have tried to play that zero-sum game that the shareholder was the only winner. And I think longer term now the shareholder is proving to be as much of a loser as everyone has been. So what I wanted to do was create an organisation was going to be long-term sustainably. And I think that's where genuine shareholder value is created in those long-term situations.
What personal thinking on your part has helped Brisbane Airport to be a game changer? I mean, how did you recognise or how did you conceptualise the big picture opportunity for Brisbane Airport when you took over as CEO?
Yeah. Well, I think there's always, as I said, there's fundamentals. If we're not safe, if we're not secure, it's game over even before you start. So you've got to get those absolutely fundamental things right. It's got to be clean, it's got to be tidy, it's got to be good value. And I'm not saying cheap, it's got to be good value. So you've got to get those fundamentals right, because if you don't get that done, you're always, every day you're putting out the bushfires, so you don't have time to think about the other bigger issues. Brisbane Airport, again, was a well-conceived airport when it was put together in the 80s, even though we can argue about where the terminals are located, but we can't change that now. But it's got a big landmass. partly that helps us in terms of keeping a lot of our noise on the airport, but it also gives us a land bank in which to develop, I suppose a counter-cyclical property portfolio. So we basically run, I think 4 businesses at the airport. There's the aeronautical business, there's our car parking, there's our retail in their terminals, and then there's our commercial property business. Airports like, say, Sydney with 900 hectares, they have a retail business, have a parking business, and an aero business that have a property business. We can have all 4 at Brisbane Airport, but unfortunately we don't have the same number of passengers as, say, Sydney, so we're a little bit more limited. But we took a view that we wanted to develop all of those 4 businesses quite strategically. So I know a lot about all those things, enough to be dangerous, but not enough to necessarily drive the change. So the thing I had to do is, I can run the airport and manage the operational stuff, but if I was going to really drive hard into those commercial businesses, I need to bring experts in and create good teams. So for me, really, the thing I had to do was to create that team. I've always felt the difference between managing and leadership is, when you're a manager, you do good things. When you're a leader, good things happen on your watch. So my job, I always felt, was to bring the right people together, make them work effectively in a team, and then give them space. Yeah.
So what do you look for in the people that you work with? I mean, what values and behaviours do they need to demonstrate for you to be interested in them?
Yeah. Well, I think I think there's 3 things I really think are very important, and clearly experience and skill. That's a given. But I like high energy. I like people who can live with uncertainty, because I think, particularly, as our life goes on at the moment, with so much disruption coming in, trying to work out what you're going to do next year, much less in 5 or 6 years, and airports live in 20-year cycles. You need to be able to feel comfortable enough in yourself that you can make decisions knowing that you may not have everything, locked away. So I think uncertainty, or being able to be comfortable in that environment is very important. And I think the third thing really is being able to work in a team. And I think there's also developments of trust and integrity in that as well.
Authenticity?
I think that's, if you're working respectfully and people can trust you, I think there is authenticity there. I think it's almost fundamental, and I think that's probably sometimes a little bit harder to work out. But I think that ability to work effectively in a team, and to understand there's got to be a little bit of give and take in that team. That if we're going to, even little simple things like we could fill every centimetre of the airport with a retail space, but then you couldn't get on the airplanes. So if my ops guy and my retail guy were having a blue, I just sort of tell them to sort it out. But it's both got to work. At the end of the day, it's got to work, and it can't be one or the other. It's got to be effectively both. So that constant negotiating, that constant understanding, and compromising a little bit to get what we want gives us the better outcome. Yeah.
So what's the one word that best describes leadership for you, or that one word?
Well, I think for me it was vision. I had plenty of people who could do stuff, but to have them all harnessed and heading in the right direction was the key, and I had to come up with that vision. And to be perfectly honest, it's not profound stuff. At the end of the day, we want to have a really an airport that works well. We want to make money for the shareholders, and we want to enjoy ourselves. It wasn't complicated. I'm sure there was there's layers of that through there, but as I said, it doesn't have to be a deeply profound vision. But I think people needed to to understand what we were trying to do. I think in a lot of businesses you can make a lot of money. But that usually means you're screwing someone, usually your customers. You can spend a lot of money, which then usually means you're screwing your shareholders. So how do you find that balance between those 2 things? And to me, and it's something I always say to staff, when you come onto the airport, that's what I want you to do, both of those things. And if you do it, you're the most employable person in Australia. Yeah.
So the one characteristic that every leader should possess?
Well, I think it's got to be resilience.
Right.
You don't get too many good days. You get a few, and even when there's a good morning, there's usually a settler in the afternoon. So you've just got to understand that at the end of the day, the sun comes up, the sun goes down. Get perspective and be resilient, and you will go through some shockers.
I love the definition of a CEO. When a CEO is wonderful moments strung together between hours of terror.
Yeah, well, I've sort of grown a bit old to be terrified anymore, but yeah, I suppose it's when you stay in an industry long enough, you do tend to have seen a lot of the worst stuff at least once or 3 times. So you do learn perspective, and you learn not to, to panic. And that's.
But if I asked your former team members to tell me about you, what do you think they'd say?
Well, I think they'd probably say I was pretty calm. That I didn't really run around with my hair on fire very often. I think they'd probably say I was probably deceptively nice. But I've never felt you had to thump the table and shout and scream, to make your point. I think you can make your point, quite clearly. I think they'd probably say it wasn't about me. I always felt that, there's almost nothing I did, as I say, but while I was there, good stuff happened, and I like to think I created that environment and gave people a chance to do it. So I always think whatever you do, it's you're part of a team. So I think that was the important thing. Yeah.
So what would you say to other, say, aspiring women leaders and entrepreneurs? What would you say? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think most of us are just normal people. Those sort of scary guys in black polos who walk around stages and profoundly charismatic. Really, most of us don't live in that space, and we need to just put them away and say, forget that.
Hide them.
That's a bit of an aberration in life. Those sort of folk. I think most of us, are really just normal people, and you've got to want something though. And I think, to me, the thing that's always been most important to me is self-awareness. If you're not honest with yourself about what your own limitations or strengths or what's actually happening, if you're pretending it's not happening, you're going to get overwhelmed. It's all going to you're just going to get washed out to sea in the big wave. So it doesn't matter how grim it is to confront whatever that thing is, and as I said, whether it's your own ignorance or a mistake you've made or a situation you've inherited, it could be many of those things. If you don't, really face that it's fair and square, you're not going to be able to manage it. Yeah, and you can't really think then about effective tactics or whatever it is to deal with it. So I think, to me, self-awareness creates people who can learn, who can fix things, and who can grow. So I think that's probably a little bit of personal courage, because it's a bit of a scary place sometimes, and I think we all feel inadequate, but yet somehow we all do a good job. And I think understanding that's the reality of most people, even the brashest and most terrifying person, probably has those moments, or other than that, they're not self-aware and they're pretty well psychopathic, and then who cares, So, so I think that's really important. And I don't think we should be worried that we're like that, and that you can show a little bit of I won't say weakness, but you can show some need for support and feel comfortable in that, because otherwise you break. And I've seen people broken by trying to be too strong or trying to control too much.
Is something of what they're not. Because the best advice you tend to get is don't be someone other than who you are. Just be yourself.
And not all of us are generalists, and I think I would say, even though I did an economics degree and I probably know a lot about operations, I am a generalist now. So I probably know enough about asphalt to be dangerous. I understand a little bit about, why things don't fall down, but I don't know how to put them up. But I feel comfortable in that space, not knowing, and learning how to trust and find the people I can trust. I've seen people who do know how to put things together and run them, who can't get beyond the detail. And once they can't control the detail, the stress levels just go through the roof. And I've seen, literally nervous breakdowns through that. So if you're that sort of person, you should do that sort of work and not try and be something you're not.
It's interesting, when you move into a CEO role, one thing you do understand is how you surround yourself with the best people, make your expectations clear, and then constantly demonstrate your trust and confidence in their capacity to deliver, and just create that space, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
But what you tend to understand is that you're not as good as any of those functional specialists.
No, not at all. But I do know how to ask the horrible question.
Yeah.
So it does help to have a reasonable awareness of what's going on. I think that's it's a profound truth, and a lot of CEOs kid themselves.
They can match it.
They can match it, and
No, there's no way.
and you've got to learn trust. Yeah.
So just to come back to your role as chair of Infrastructure Australia, what is it about the infrastructure space that excites you?
Well, I think, as I said, it doesn't matter whether we, work in a building like this or in a hospital or in an airport. How the back of house works, how it's built, how it all operates, to me has always been deeply interesting. I remember as a kid reading those books, Arthur Haley books. You remember those books?
Yeah.
I loved.
Airport.
But it was all about back of house, and I found that much more interesting than, the sexy love story in the front of it. So.
Does anyone remember that book? Arthur Haley's book. You remember that, Ken? Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to be much older than most of you guys to remember that. But he said I love that and how things work and how things work well. I've always loved. But I think what I learned as I got older and got more involved in how airports contribute to their city, and I think I remember a conversation we had at the Brisbane Airport just after we'd finally got all of the ducks in a row to get the runway built, and that meant we had to get all the environmentals, we had to get all the shareholders across the line, we had to get the airlines across the line, we had to get the government across the line. And then we had to get, the banks across the line. So a lot of people had to, tick that box before we could actually say. So finally we got it done. We said, okay, now we're going to do this thing. Wow, what does it mean that in 5 or 6 years we're going to double our capacity? And what are we going to do with that opportunity? And you've got no idea how that stimulated the thinking in the organisation. So I learned even that very simple thing that good infrastructure catalyses opportunity and imagination, and if it's well done and it's well conceived and well planned, it can be extraordinarily powerful. And I think one of the things we're seeing here in Brisbane with things like the metro and the crossover rail, when both of those projects were originally conceived, they were about getting cars off roads and people onto trains. Great idea, important to not get congestion, but no one got excited about some South Brisbane streets having less traffic. But now you're seeing them as urban redevelopment projects that are going to enable regeneration of our city along those stations. They're fully integrated. With an additional rail crossing over the river, we're going to see the opportunity to get better rail connection up, all the way to Noosa or whatever it is goes up there. It's in Amber and then down to effectively to Tweed eventually. So this is one relatively contained project that throws up all of those opportunities. And in watching over the last 3 years, as it's gone from that road rail project to this urban redevelopment project and how it's catalysed, you see the same thing going on in Melbourne, around the Melbourne Metro, and even little things like those rail crossings in Victoria. Each of those little communities have lost that congestion point. It's invigorated them. So, but how do we get the good decisions? How do we get the right sort of infrastructure built? How do we make sure that money's not wasted? That's what I'm finding really, exciting now, because I think the message is out there that infrastructure can really help our communities. But now, how do we get the very best of our infrastructure selected and funded? Yeah.
One of the reasons for the Victorian government being re-elected, of course.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's, and when you listen and you read what's coming out of that, in many cases, it's probably not Melbourne Metro, because it's still, still probably the vision rather than the reality. But the reality of another police station, the reality of another school, the reality of that railway crossing disappearing in your community, right across Victoria, it's not a Melbourne solution. This has been a Victorian solution, and I think that's what's really worked for the Victorian government. And I think if we can one of the things we're looking at IA is, while we deal with the mega projects, and, we could talk about mega projects and usually how disappointing they can be sometimes. But how do we get good system, how do, and I think, again, the railway crossing is a good one. There's about 80 of those, so no one project, would come anywhere near an IA consideration because we deal with things 100 million plus. But the 80 certainly comes into our sort of ambit. So we're trying to encourage jurisdictions now to think about what would they look at a system level. Is it signalling on the trains? Is it better lights in the city to get green waves and things like that through the city, and invest maybe instead of billions, hundreds of millions, because these aren't cheap because it's tech. But it's probably going to get more. You get 20% improvement in capacity on our rail system with better signalling. Is that a better investment than maybe another line somewhere? Yeah.
So, what drives you? Is there a central purpose or burning desire here? What really drives you?
Oh, I suppose I just like things to work well, and where I see opportunities to contribute to that, I tend to take them. And I think there's so much opportunity in almost every industry. The things I'm involved in nowadays, I'm working on the Senate of University of Queensland now. There's so much disruption happening at tertiary level, whether it's funding, whether it's tech, whether it's how do we deal with old buildings, how do we fund new buildings? That has got to be a sector under so much disruption and challenge, and it's just fascinating to try and find a way to help, some of that decision making to get the right decisions there. I'm in ERM Power, we're playing literally for us on the edge of energy policy, but energy policy again, it's so important, that we get, things like power, water, comms working in our cities. Can in any way I can help to, to get that debate at least lively. Yeah.
I've got a Twitter question, which is, how do you now balance your role as a board member, chair, with the aligning or leading the organisational vision with CEO, MD role? How do you those respective roles between a chairman or a member of the board and your CEO role?
Yeah, look, I think probably as a CEO, MD, you're in the line, you're operational, you're on call, you're dealing with issues all the time. I think as a board member and as a chair, unless you've got something going on that's extra, it's more of a measured approach, and I do think as an ex-CEO, the role of a board member versus the role of a staff member are very different, and those boundaries should be respected. So I think I've got to be careful as I get asked a lot in some agencies to get involved in management things because I'm recent experience, and I've got to keep on remembering I'm not management anymore. I'm bored, and I've got to have a different sort of role.
It's hard to shed that role as a CEO, isn't it, when you become a board member? You tend to ask the questions that you would have raised as a CEO, and you've got to avoid that as a board member.
Sometimes
Yeah.
I think those questions still have to be asked,
Yeah, of course,
particularly if the CEO is not asking them.
Yeah, but it's the nature of the questions.
Yeah. And it happens, don't worry. So I think the role is more one of challenge, I think, as a board member than as a CEO, where you sort of probably in your relationship with the board, you're more trying to work with them to get them to think your way. So I don't think I'm only a few months full time into this, so I'm still sort of trying to work it out. It's probably a little bit different with IA because that's quite a defined role. We have the board has legislative duties, which is not what you'd probably find in a commercial organisation. So. So there's different sort of boards, and I'm on the 4 boards I'm on are all very, very different, and all have different effective constitutions, I suppose. So it's getting your head around.
But you've got a pretty clear criteria for the boards you're prepared to join, right?
Yeah, there've got to be things I'm interested in. I'm far too old now to do things I don't like to do anymore. I've earned my time to to select.
Be selective.
Yeah.
Good.
So, yeah, the things I'm taking on are very much things, and I like to do. Yeah.
Just want to ask a little bit more on this one point. Is what do you know about yourself now that you didn't know about yourself in those early days? What have you discovered about yourself?
Well, I think I'm much tougher than I thought I was. I've gone through a couple of pretty traumatic episodes, once at Sydney and once at Brisbane, where I think in both times part of the solution would have been get rid of me. One, because it probably wouldn't have solved the problem, but it would have satisfied people who were criticising what was going on. And I think knowing you can actually get through that without necessarily curling up in a little ball in the corner and
A fetal position.
and saying, yeah, it's all too hard. And also to be able to keep on managing a team through that. Because at the end of the day, it's not really about you. You're just the, your potential the roadkill. But at the end of the day, your job is to try and sort of lead your team or your organisation through that process and hopefully out the other side.
And don't allow your identity to be tied up in the role.
Yeah,
CEOs
to a certain extent. It's hard, when it's very public. But the interesting thing is if you come out the other side intact, it's amazing. And and the respect you get, and from surviving those things was really quite surprising. And I didn't really think I had that much toughness in me, because I like to get things done as pleasantly as possible. But to know you can go the hard yards and do the hard negotiations was actually profoundly satisfying to think I could do that.
So what was your biggest challenge in pulling the team together at BAC as you were driving change?
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem, is a lot of people live in Brisbane because they like a much more relaxed lifestyle, and not always the talent there. Sometimes you might to drive things a little bit harder. I think that's changed even in the time I've been here. I think more and more people are realising the city's growing and changing, and you can carve a career. But I still think it's reasonably difficult to have a long-term corporate career in Brisbane. It's easy to get a job. It's not so easy to get the second and third job.
True.
Yeah.
That's true.
So so finding finding talent was part of it. But I think that was probably that's probably the hardest thing. Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience? Look, just put your hand up if there are, because we have microphones. We might take the question here first. Thank you.
I wonder if you could just talk for a few moments about managing politics in the organisation, the types of strategies and techniques that you use. Of course, with projects, they're often rife with politics, and often that can be quite detrimental to executing and delivering.
Yeah. But usually once I got to the exalted role of CEO, frankly, I just won't tolerate it. I call it out pretty early on. At Brisbane Airport, we spend a lot of time preparing for projects. And I think projects that go well are usually well initiated. Projects that are rushed and are poorly structured usually keep on, deteriorating as time goes on. So, pulling the right sort of teams together, trying to work out what is the right procurement model, what are the general risks, and I think the fundamental thing for me is risk management. Through that process, and teams not working effectively is probably one of the bigger risks. So we spend a lot of time pulling apart the risk on all sorts of projects and trying to think of mitigations early on. I also, and again, probably with bigger projects, I really like to use independent chairs of project control groups. someone who's got the, either the stature or the competence to call out bad behaviour early and intervene before it gets too entrenched. And certainly we've certainly run programs to sort out disputes and things like that. And if push comes to shove, you just move on. Those who can't line up, with what we're trying to achieve. So I think it's a lot to do with the culture. If you're going to work in that space, you're going to have to live by certain rules, and for us, respect and collaboration were fundamental. And if you didn't like to work like that, there's probably plenty of other places where you could,
and bring out the behaviours that are unacceptable, right?
Yeah, and I think you've got to call it rather than, And I think that's something else I learned. I used to think I wouldn't be able to do that, but I found as I got older, I had less worries about just saying it quite openly, it ain't on, mate, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I remember Jack Welch at GE, one of his leading managers, biggest business unit, making most of the results, percentage of results. So he was performing on every single scale except his behaviours. He didn't demonstrate support for the values. No. So he called him out, he sacked him. He was prepared, he had to make that statement. No matter how you're performing, if you don't behave in the way the company expects you to with the culture, you're out of there. Mm. Another question here? Any other questions? Right at the back. Thank you.
Julieanne, David Muir, just do you accept the proposition that the board has the responsibility for the culture of the company? And do directors on boards ask enough questions?
Well, I don't think the board has sole responsibility. I think the senior the CEO and the senior management are the ones who are living it day to day, and I think if they're not on board, if they're not, if they haven't defined the culture and then and live it every day, the board I don't think is going to make too much of a difference. I think the board has to decide who they want to employ and the sort of person they want to run their organisation and how they recruit and to understand how that team is put together. And I think, to make it clear that they've got expectations of that. But I think at the end of the day, implementation has got to be at the line. And, and I think so, you put the right people in place to start with and then you monitor. And I do think it's quite a dilemma, though, that we're facing, in corporate life as to expectations. And I've not for a long time been involved in a really big organisation where, you probably don't see everybody in a given week, and how you make sure that culture is right down, through into the ground level. I think it's a real challenge. But, knowing a couple of people on boards who are going through some extraordinary problems at the moment, I just don't know how they would know some of the things they're supposed to know.
No, that's the point. The expectations of board members today
is really, really tough.
Yeah,
and I think it's one of the reasons as I've sort of had the opportunity to think about a couple of board roles, could I do what I'm supposed to do anymore? And I'm, in those bigger organisations, then the other question is, do I want to? And I must admit, at the moment, in some cases I have said no because I don't think I could do it. And I've said no because I don't want to do it. And I think that's going to be one of the big dilemmas, is to find people who want to do stuff when there's so much risk attached, when you can't manage it. Yeah. I've always been someone who's been able to identify and manage risk, and I like that. And once I've come out of that comfort zone, I'm not sure I'm going to be all of that effective.
Based on these expectations now, to be a director of a listed public company, it's a tough proposition.
Well, particularly if it's in an industry where you don't know necessarily the fundamentals.
You don't understand the risk, you don't have a clear view of strategy and so on.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, right here, thanks. Oh, sorry, we'll go. You right? Thanks.
So for the future young leaders who are in this room aspiring to be a senior decision maker, what advice would you give?
Yeah. Well, I think I'd probably say patience is important. I think I was a much better CEO because I came to be a CEO after a lot of other work experience, and where I probably had, for me, family responsibilities had diminished, and so I had time. Being a CEO is very, very time consuming. You're never off. And if you're in an operational business, it's even more engaged. I think one of the things of not being a CEO I enjoy at the moment is I don't have to go to endless events and functions and talk for the company. I could have been out every night of the week as a CEO doing legitimate work, to try and network and foster support for the company. So I think you've got to work out what else you want in your life. And the answer, I think, for most of us is at different times in your life, there's going to be different opportunities and different things you want to do. And if you're not careful, you miss out on really important parts of your family life when they're younger and things like that. So, I was in my mid-50s when I became a CEO, and I think I was very, I think I had a lot of confidence, a lot of understanding of myself, and I wasn't as dependent that if I made a mistake, this is not going to be my last job. Whereas if I'd been 40, that would have been terrifying. To think I could wipe myself out. So I know a lot of people are really impatient and they feel they've got to do it straight away. And I think if that's what you really want to do, go for it. But it's not the only way of doing it. And I think there's lots and lots of ways of approaching success and what success ultimately means. But I do think, irrespective of when and who and what you are, you've really got to understand that you have that skill set. And I've seen people in their younger years who don't have the skill set, who 10 years later did. And that is that comfortableness with uncertainty, with not managing detail, but being able to build a team that is strong enough that's going to support you through that process. And these aren't easy things to do. So unless you've got those sort of skills, you've had some opportunity to learn a bit about that, there's time to do that.
Julieanne, it's amazing too when you look back on your first CEO role and you think how little I knew.
Oh.
How did I get away with it?
That wasn't me, of course, but oh yeah. I think one of the, I'd been the general manager for a long time, which I thought was pretty analogous to being a CEO. And but what I had, we'd sort of, I'd build a team over probably half a dozen years, and we were pretty free-flowing. We'd throw ideas around, we'd debate them, and I could say things that people wouldn't take me seriously. They would actually challenge me. What I realised as a CEO, you don't get challenged too much to start with. And so before I knew a couple of times things were getting done that I hadn't really expected to get done, I just sort of thought, well, what happens if I say this? And the next thing I know, they were doing it. And I said, I had to learn to tell a team, I'm not that sort of CEO, you can tell me it's rubbish. So you learn very quickly. And I think the other thing and one of my former board directors is here, he's probably going to be horrified when I say this, but one thing I didn't really realise is how important your relationship with shareholders was. I sort of thought that sort of looked after itself if you occasionally talk to them, but I realised pretty smart that when the times are tough, if your shareholders don't know you and have not spent time with you, and that you haven't shared with them your thinking and your vision, they're not going to be there and you're out. So I learned very, very quickly that you had to have a genuine engagement program with your shareholders, as well as other stakeholders, but I didn't quite get that to start with.
So what would you like the headline of your life to be? What would you like the headline of your life to be?
Oh, well, I think that I just probably made my bit of the world better. I think, I think that's all you can ask for.
Exactly. Yeah. Please thank Julieanne Alroe.
Thank you.
Julieanne, thank you for a wonderful and wide-ranging discussion tonight, and a reminder of how important it is that we've moved well beyond a career choice between nuns, nurses and teachers. You've given us many gems, but if I were to choose three that I would want people to take away, they would be these. Firstly, the importance of community engagement. Secondly, in employing people looking for finishes. And thirdly, never believing that it's a zero-sum game. If we all take those messages away and put them into practice, you will have given us some great gifts tonight. For those of you who'd like to revisit the conversation or share it with friends and colleagues, the webcast and transcript will be available on the SLQ website within the next week. May I propose on your behalf a special vote of thanks to Ray Weeks for yet again a masterful performance in leading Game Changers again this year. Ray's experience in business and as a facilitator and his enthusiasm shone through yet again tonight. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got an exciting program of Game Changers speakers in store for 2019. Stay tuned via the Hall of Fame website for announcements in the coming months. We hope to welcome you back to another Game Changers event early in the new year. On behalf of the Governing Committee and the founding partners of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame, I'd like to thank again our sponsors who've made the work of the Hall of Fame possible in 2018. So thank you to principal sponsor Picture Partners, our television sponsor Channel 7, and our major sponsors Morgans, NAB and the RACQ. We're very grateful for your ongoing support and your commitment to this program. Please now, ladies and gentlemen, join us on the Queensland Terrace for refreshments, supported by our generous sponsors Clovelly Estate and Newstead Brewing. Thank you for your attendance.